Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of DejaVue. It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do because, well, we are on our mid-30s episode, something like that. Quite episodes on already. And maybe you've discovered that this episode never before. So thanks for joining. Or maybe you've listened to all the other ones beforehand. Nevertheless, usually Michael's here, my co-host, but he's not today. He skipped a few episodes before. Now it's his turn. But luckily, I'm not alone here. I am joined by the wonderful CJ, who is a senior creator at Syntax. He's streaming on Twitch regularly, has some nice YouTube videos up there. You can find him on all social medias. And I'm very happy that he's joining me for this episode. Hi, CJ. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. And it's always nice that like these things align somehow. And I remember like when we got in touch, I'm like, oh yeah, how about joining? I think I hit you up on some of the live streams on Twitter.
It was the Twitch chat or the YouTube chat.
Yes.
And you're like, want to go on the podcast? I was like, yeah, let's do it.
So. Yeah. It's like, I always like these way of like contacting because like in a way it feels kind of natural. Just like, hey, okay, you do cool content that could be a nice fit. Want to join?
Definitely.
So, and also like there was an episode with Matt Pocock, who also like everybody listening for a few episodes might know already. And if not, then definitely check out the episode where I also jumped on his stream where he played Euro Truck Simulator. I was also just like, nice. Hey, how about join? It's like, yeah, okay, let's do it. So yeah, in a way that's some part of the podcast history apparently to do that. And yeah, starting straight away with that. So you're live streaming, as just said before, you're a senior creator at Syntax FM. So maybe you could give us a little insight what that actually means in terms of your job, what you're doing there, and then we can talk more about Vue.js.
Sure. So yeah, I'm a senior creator at Syntax. I joined there back in February. And so if you haven't heard of Syntax, they are a web dev and programming focused podcast. It's hosted by Wes Boss and Scott Tolinsky. They publish 3 episodes a week. And about 2 years ago, the podcast got acquired by a company called Sentry. And so Sentry does error reporting. And they had sponsored a few episodes, but they were like, hey, why don't we just buy the whole podcast? And now every episode is brought to you by Sentry. So that happened 2 years ago. And then about a year ago, the Syntax team wanted to start expanding. And so they were looking for someone to help them create YouTube videos and kind of build out their content there. And so that's what I've been doing for them for the past almost a year, is essentially topics that are covered on the podcast. I'll create deeper dive videos and publish those to YouTube. And sometimes I'll do topics that I'm interested in as well. And I also have a side gig called Coding Garden. It's basically how I got the Syntax job. So Coding Garden is my YouTube and Twitch channel where I live stream myself coding and teaching. So a lot of times I'm building apps from scratch, whether it's full stack or just front end or back end. I'm solving algorithmic problems. So a lot of times I'll do code war, sometimes leak code. And then other times we just have general code chat. So like people can come in and ask career questions or code questions, and I give my best answer, but it's also a big community of like people in the chat, like yourself sometimes, who can chime in with good tips and stuff like that. And so a lot of those live streams that happen on Twitch and YouTube, those will get cut down into shorter videos on the Coding Garden YouTube channel as well.
Sweet. Yeah, I just want to ask because you said, okay, you joined almost a year ago as a content creator, and like how did it happen? But of course, with Coding Garden being already there, I guess that was the best reference could tell people like, hey, look, I'm doing amazing content, so I could do it for you too.
Basically. And so I've worked professionally as a software developer for a while. And so I was working at a software consultancy and doing Coding Garden part-time. And then I decided I wanted to start doing Coding Garden full-time. So I left that consultancy. And so I was doing Coding Garden full-time as like the only thing I was doing for roughly a year. And then I saw that the Syntax senior creator position opened up. And I mean, I've worked a lot of different jobs. So I've been a software developer. I have been a programming teacher. I used to teach at a boot camp in full stack programming. And I've worked at big companies, small companies, and I didn't know what I wanted to do next because I was doing Coding Garden full time. But the Syntax position popped up and I was like, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of what I'm doing already, but now I can do it on a bigger scale and work with a team of like really smart people. So yeah, I applied for that and got the gig. So.
Yeah, sweet. Also, congrats to that, of course. Even though it's almost a year later, still it's pretty amazing. I think it makes a lot of sense to like deepen the content there because like I remember like also being myself someone who's listening to syntax every now and then. Recently a bit less, but I remember like when I still commuted to some places, and was like, okay, in the morning let's listen to the episode, there we go. But I remember, of course, it was also an audio only or video podcast for a while, and now video is also included, and then with all the deep dive videos there's more and more content there. So I like to see that there's more content for developers who are interested in generally web development and all what's going on. So that's really nice to see.
Definitely. And I had a similar experience. Like it used to be like when I commuted or like if I'm on long road trips. And these days, like if I'm sitting in an airport or on an airplane, I would listen to syntax. So it was pretty cool to, and like for the longest time, I couldn't even believe that they actually hired me because I was so used to hearing them on the podcast. And so, yeah.
And now you're working with them, so yes.
Exactly.
No, it's pretty amazing. On the other hand, I can also imagine like leaving your, let's say, your own project from doing it full time to then only like doing it part time again, let's say, was probably also not necessarily an easy step, right?
Yeah, and I'm actually creating very different types of content for syntax because Coding Garden was very live and in the moment. So most of what I did was in a live stream or edited down from a live stream. And so I didn't have a lot of experience creating specifically like planned and structured videos, but that's the kind of thing that I'm doing over on syntax. And so I think I'm getting better at it, but that's one of the things that was a little like a shift in my work style is instead of just going live and talking about a thing, now I'm doing a lot of planning, I'm recording, I'm editing, I'm going back and doing more editing and planning. And so, yeah, like right now I do every video that you see that's come out that I've done, I do the full process. So I do the research, the deep dive, I put all the code examples, I film myself, I edit it down, I add any assets if there need to be. So yeah, it's definitely a different process than completely live.
Oh, absolutely. For me, it's a little bit of the opposite with like my YouTube channel where I mainly do like pre-planned videos and everything. And then my editor, who's also my partner, so that's a big plus there, is like editing the videos, also like as an audio engineer, doing the podcast here as well. So big shout out at that point.
Nice.
I really can focus on the content, and then I still, of course, plan everything. And when I do live streams, which I rarely have the time at the moment due to like conference and traveling, but still try to squeeze it in, it's also more like it's so different because then you can just do whatever feels like, what the audience is interested, what the chat, the community, as you know, like then you get sidetracked or you do something totally different, but it's still super valuable for the people listening or for the people watching later the VOD and YouTube, for example.
Definitely. And I have found like it's a different kind of audience because it takes a certain type of person that's just going to sit there for 2 hours, 3 hours to wait for something interesting to happen. But yeah, it's I think especially on Coding Garden, I've kind of built that community of, well, we're going to go live. I'm going to talk to the chat. It's going to be interactive. But at the same time, I still have somewhat of a plan and I kind of know what I'm doing. So you can expect like if you're trying to learn, you're going to learn something along the way. And I think for a lot of people, they like to see my process because that's a very different thing from like edited tutorials and videos is you kind of see the happy path. You see the version of it that just works. You don't see all the bugs and the mistakes along the way. So in a live stream, you see that there's no covering it up. So if something doesn't work, we have to figure it out. And so a lot of people like can learn from kind of seeing me do it live as well. Like, well, how do I read the docs? How do I debug a specific error? Those kinds of things as well.
I think that's also, as you just mentioned, like the process of how people work is sometimes so much more important than actually the result of like, okay, we do this now, just because like you'll see a lot of things. It can be like a shortcut that people use, or like, I don't know, VS Code snippet or whatnot, or just saying like, okay, here's my analytic way of dealing with that problem. And people might find, okay, that's also a way to consider it. I don't have to, I don't know, console log until I found a problem. I can also like go from like a top down view or to use debugger or whatnot. So
exactly.
It's really, really helpful. And that's always the trade-off. If you have, of course, like some long form content, it's so nice because you can show the whole process. While of course, if the shorter it gets, then it's really more focused on, hey, we do this. That's the way the short most, or like even if just, I don't know, YouTube short with like a minute, there we go, that's it, and you're done.
Right.
But it loses so much information. On the other hand, of course, people can get into it and say like, hey, want to know more, then take a look at the whole stream or join next time, so on. So it can be a little bit of a gateway drug too, so to say.
Definitely. And I kind of see it as like you're more so because a lot of people will see tutorials first, right? They're going to see the shorter content that, like you're saying, it's the gateway. It's the first thing they're going to see. But once they really start to try to do it themselves, instead of just watching the video, they try and go and do it. They realize, oh, this is a whole lot harder. And so being able to see someone do it instead of just seeing the end product, I think is helpful for a lot of people as well.
100%. Also, like that, to overcome imposter syndrome, for example, is you're like, okay, people like programming every day, or like people even working on frameworks, they still don't know everything. They still Google things, they still try out things. Their tests will also fail 100 times before they pass. And that's, it's just so nice to see like, okay, well, all humans will make mistakes, and still like we learn from certain things.
Yeah. And that's one thing I've gotten good at, is being able to make mistakes live. And it's like, if something goes wrong, because I mean, a lot of people that maybe if you're in this space as a creator, and maybe you only do conference talks, or maybe you've only made YouTube videos, if you're ever in a situation where something goes wrong, you don't necessarily have a lot of practice trying to figure that out. So if you're trying to do like a live demo in a conference talk or something like that, you could be like a deer in the headlights. But I feel like I've had so much practice just being okay with getting something wrong and then taking a deep breath, figuring it out. And so that's another skill that I think I've developed, is just like, I get things wrong. I'm human. We're all human. So
100%. Yeah. I still remember there were like 2 talks of all the ones I've given so far. That I really clearly remember where things just gone total south, and it's like, okay, let's see what happens. And everything that could break broke. But you have to deal with it in that moment. So that's fine. And people will be okay with that. People say like, okay, yeah, happens. It's okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
But that also helps to have maybe sometimes a plan B to say like, okay, if that really doesn't work, especially for like, I don't know, live coding a talk, maybe prepare something beforehand. It's also like when the first time it really fails, to be like, okay, you know what? Let's just reset the project real quick, go through that. It takes 5 minutes more, but then we're in a good state.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think the more you do it, the more you figure out those things that you need to do ahead of time to make sure that you're prepared. So yeah.
True. And also getting a bit more relaxed, at least it helped me a lot with like doing a lot of live coding, or also like the streams. Like, okay, you get used to making mistakes, you get used how to debug that, and you also get, of course, better, and you like quicker at finding out, okay, that's a problem, let's see. So that's in a way really great, even though it's very scary at first. And if people, especially at conference talks, be like, oh yeah, live coding, something goes wrong or the internet connection fails, and yeah, but in the end, people will enjoy it. That's the thing.
Yeah, definitely.
So now that we talked a lot about content creation, let's get into your story with Vue.js. So maybe even start in terms of web development. How did you start getting into web development and frameworks like Vue.js in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, web development goes way back. It started with MySpace custom themes, so like building out custom themes for like custom CSS and stuff like that. And then eventually, I got into creating Flash animations. And so for that, I actually learned a little bit of ActionScript, which is actually based on ECMAScript, so it's based on the same thing as JavaScript. So I had a little bit of experience with that, and yeah, I did a lot of that just in my spare time in high school. And then I got a computer science degree. And then my first job out of university was actually doing C# and .NET desktop development. But there was a point where I was working on a project and it required like a desktop app. But I was like, this could work in the web browser. So I kind of started to figure out how that could work. And then I discovered this little thing called AngularJS. So this was back in probably like 2011, 2012. And I remember like I implemented this site with jQuery, and I was like, oh, this is great. Like I don't need a desktop app anymore. I just build the API and then I can build it with jQuery. And then I found Angular, and like the code shrunk in half, and I was like, oh, this Angular thing is awesome. And so, yeah, so I started with Angular, and then I fell in love with AngularJS. So I built a ton of stuff with AngularJS. And that's kind of my path into Vue.js. So for anybody that was around that time, that's kind of how you could see Vue.js. It was like the middle ground between AngularJS and React, because it uses the virtual DOM, or Vue uses the virtual DOM, but the syntax and the directives are very similar to AngularJS. And I guess I'll clarify, we're talking about Angular 1, the original AngularJS, not the new stuff, which I haven't kept up with. But the syntax these days looks so much different and so much crazier than it used to with AngularJS. But so yeah, I built a lot of apps with AngularJS. And then I worked that job for a while, and then eventually became an instructor of full stack development at a coding bootcamp, and they were teaching AngularJS in the program. But then they decided to switch to a React curriculum. So I was a part of that transition. But I think it was roughly around 2015 or 2016, one of my coworkers was like, you should check out Vue.js.
Nice.
And then I tried it, and I was like, where has this been? Because I basically went from AngularJS to React. And then I found Vue.js and I was like, this is it. Why doesn't everybody use this? This is like, the syntax is shorter. We can mutate state and things just work. It's less code. There's less boilerplate. And so, yeah, I started using Vue.js around 2016. And then after that, almost every single side project I was doing with Vue.js. And so I built like just internal tools at the coding bootcamp. So like I built a tool to help people track their learning progress, and I built that with Vue. I built a tool for the admissions team, because for new people coming in, they typically would have a portfolio of projects that they've done and example code to get into the coding bootcamp. And so I wrote an admissions app that would help with that process. That was built with Vue, a bunch of other side projects. And I think that's kind of my story with Vue.js, is it's always been, it's my side thing, because after working at that coding bootcamp, I got hired at a consultancy and they built everything with React. And so I was building production React apps for like over 3 years. But in my spare time, everything I was doing was Vue. And I actually took over running the Vue.js meetup here in Denver, Colorado. And so 2 of my students had actually started the Vue.js meetup. And then they went off and got jobs where they were doing other things. And I was like, I mean, I can pick it up. So I took it over for them, and then started running the Vue.js meetup along with a previous coworker and student, Marlena. And so we ran the Vue.js meetup for a long time. And for a certain time, we used to call the Vue.js meetup like the Vue support group, because everybody that showed up, like nobody wrote Vue professionally. Everybody was like, yeah, we do it on the side, or we really like it, or it was like beginners that were trying to learn it. And this was really before it kind of like took off, where more people, at least in the US, are using it professionally and at consultancies and stuff like that.
So that was like around like the Vue 2 times. You said like the early Vue 2 times, something like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the timeline here, because I think, I would have ran that meetup from 2017 up until and we kept running it after COVID. So we even ran it remotely after 2020. But so, the in-person meetups would have been like 2017, 2018, where it was like the Vue support group. Yeah.
But is the meetup still running, or did you eventually shut it down?
So it's transitioned. So basically, like COVID hit the meetup scene really hard, like a lot of meetups. Yeah. And we tried to go remote. So we were remote for about 1.5 years. And then like the membership dwindled and we couldn't find speakers. Like a lot of times, like the Vue meetup was also just me giving talks about Vue stuff that I like, because it was hard to find speakers. And so, we ran it remotely for about 1.5 years. And then we're like, all right, we're going to put it on hiatus. And then I think roughly 2 years ago, a woman, Paige, reached out to me and she was like, hey, are you running this anymore? Do you want to spin it back up? And I was like, we should spin this back up. So we started it back up in person. Number of people showing up increased just a little bit. It was all right. But the DenverScript meetup here in Denver had actually gone on hiatus. So I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but I'm trying to get the storyline, which is basically DenverScript was happening. It was the biggest JavaScript meetup in Denver. Yeah. And then the organizers kind of got burnt out after COVID. They didn't really want to do it remotely anymore. And so they stepped down. And then I think it stayed dormant for about 1 year. And then I started to think, well, if I'm spending all my energy organizing the Vue meetup, why not kind of like bring it into the greater DenverScript meetup and then organize that instead? And so my co-organizer Marlena and I got some few other organizers together. So at the time we got Will Klein, we got Cass, and Will has stepped down since then, but now we have a person named Ched. But basically, we all got together and like, all right, we're going to do the DenverScript thing now. And essentially, Vue.js Denver is no more. But we still have Vue-related talks at the DenverScript meetup. We try to showcase all frameworks. So pretty much anything JavaScript related is allowed at that meetup. And so,
sweet.
Yeah.
So whoever wants to give a talk in Denver, Colorado, about JavaScript, anything with JavaScript frameworks, they should reach out because DenverScript is the way to go there.
Definitely, yeah. And the meetup scene is kind of, it's getting better and growing more. Because like we said, it got like most meetups shut down after COVID. But we host our meetup at a place called Code Talent. And if you look on their calendar, they host the Denver Python meetup. There's like a Java user group. There's an APIs meetup, an AI meetup. And so the meetup scene is really growing more and more. And the number of attendees at DenverScript is growing more and more every time. as well. So
Yeah, there's also, I think, a phenomenon that I've seen in a lot of meetup groups as well, be it like here in the Netherlands, where I'm based right now, but also in Germany, with lots of people running meetups that I know. They say like, yeah, look, it's getting there step by step, but of course, after COVID, after everything went remote, and yeah, like going back to some meetups was somehow really difficult. Of course, also people who ran the meetups were like, yeah, not sure if I still can do that, or I changed my focus, or hey, no time anymore, which is totally reasonable, of course, because a meetup is, of course, a lot of time and effort and work too. Like, I really enjoyed the meetup culture before COVID. I like spoken so many. I just attended a lot of meetups because it's so nice to sync with people, to like just chatting with people using the same language or framework, and generally have a good time. So I'm very happy to see that not declining anymore and getting better.
yeah, and that's kind of my motivation is like I want there to be a space for people to be able to connect, to get together, and because like I have no other motivation outside of just community building. Like I just want a place for people to get together. Because so I did an episode on the Syntax podcast talking about running the DenverScript meetup and like kind of like what it takes, and like ultimately it just takes somebody wanting to run the meetup, because
Yeah,
a lot of people don't. It's responsibility. You have to be a little organized. And so I'm kind of that person, at least for now, you know. So,
perfect. And
yeah.
like going from the meetup real quick back to the Vue support group topic
Yeah.
of like, it's so
Well,
interesting.
yeah.
It's so interesting to see that like you and so many others as well wrote like Vue on the side, while in their main jobs they wrote mainly React, I guess, as it's common in the US, and maybe even like some legacy, I don't know, AngularJS back then, and so on and so on. I'm just curious why you didn't switch to like React if you did it in your main job in production. Why did Vue stuck with you throughout the whole time, so to say?
I've thought about this a lot, and I do think it's because of my early days of AngularJS. I've thought about this more and more lately, because you see so many people where all they know is React. Their entire career, all they've ever written is React. They don't even know there are other options out there. And I think like what you work on and spend a lot of time on, definitely in your early years of programming, it kind of like it shapes your opinions, it shapes your way of doing things. And so for me, it was AngularJS, and it was like I was always searching for something that was that simple and had all this stuff built in. And ultimately it became Vue.js, and then eventually Svelte as well. So I write a lot of Svelte code these days, and it's also kind of like a natural progression. It's such a hard thing to say, oh, well, I'm writing Svelte now instead of Vue.js, because it was such a hard battle to get people to realize Vue is a thing and they should be using Vue. And so I kind of went back and forth, like with the announcement of runes in Svelte. And so Svelte 5 just got released and they had runes in them. And I'm coming around to them. But my initial reaction was like, this is not simple anymore. I want simple. I want no boilerplate. And that's what Vue.js is. So for a while, I switched from Svelte, and like any side project, I would be using Vue. One thing I will mention, though, is about the Vue support group. When we kicked the meetup back off in 2022, it was actually crazy for me to see, because the people showing up actually wrote Vue professionally. So I did the thing where I was like, raise your hand if you write Vue at work. And it was like 80% of the crowd. And I was like, I have never seen this many Vue.js developers in Denver in the same room at the same time. So it's definitely gaining traction in the US as well. And I think in terms of like comparing it to Svelte, there's probably a lot more professional jobs using Vue than Svelte, just because it's been around a little bit longer.
Yeah, 10 years by now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what a lot of like React devs don't even realize, is how long, like Vue has been around basically as long as React. Maybe it came out maybe a few months after. But yeah, so I don't know. I think people writing React and starting with React, it really shapes their brain and their opinions in a certain way where it's harder to see the benefits. And I guess for me, like, if I could just talk about the benefits, like one of the main things I like is being able to mutate state. Like React introduced immutability. It introduced this idea of like state updates, and that gets really cumbersome, especially if you're working with like deeply nested data or really complex data. And there are libraries that help with that. But I think one of the issues the React ecosystem has is, of course, if you find those libraries, it's great, but not everyone is using those libraries. And there's multiple options for those libraries. So like for immutable state, you could use, yeah, exactly. So you could use like Immer, or there's immutable.js. And so you might come across a project that's using one of those, but maybe it's not. And then you have this big old spaghetti code of like object spread and stuff like that. And so with Vue, you can mutate state. You literally just modify the variable, and the Vue updates, and you don't have to worry about bringing in a separate library or spreading state, or even like a lot of it's interesting to see React developers try and go and use Vue because they've got it in their mind so much that like if I want to remove something from an array, I should use filter. But filter creates a brand new array. You can mutate it. You can just use splice and remove it directly from the array versus allocating new memory and creating a brand new array. So yeah, writing React code all the time definitely changes how you think about programming. And I think it makes it harder to potentially see the benefits, and at the same time, I also understand that people can't just jump to another framework, right? Especially like you're not going to rewrite your whole React code base in Vue.
But I think that's a good point. Like, to say people can, but companies, of course, can't. Like that's the takeaway. I wouldn't say like, sure, you don't say, oh yeah, I switched from React to, I don't know, Solid or Svelte or Vue just because of why not. If you have like an important case where like, hey, we have an application that should be, I don't know, super performant, we have a lot of, data visualization or something, then you might consider, hey, okay, there is Svelte 5 now super fast, or Solid, or Vue with way more in the future. So we could use that. But otherwise, you stick with what you have. Of course, there's the benefit of React being more or less a pioneer in the space, and that everybody, like a big part of the ecosystem adopted it.
Definitely. And that's kind of what you see as well, because like companies, they made that decision to choose React 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And so that like they basically made a long-term decision of we're going to be building with React. So we're going to hire React developers and our product is built with React. And so really the only space you see or only place you'll see the possibility of even switching is greenfield projects. So I'm starting a new project. What are my options? Maybe especially you're working at a company where you've seen what can happen in a large React code base or the kind of code that gets written or the kind of troubles that you might run into. And so maybe you're looking for something else. And I definitely think Vue is an answer there. If you're looking for something that has less boilerplate, typically, and I guess I'll talk about the less boilerplate thing as well. Like that's one thing that I just couldn't understand how so many React developers were just so okay with add event listener and update state for every single input that you want to bind to state. Like, no, I don't know why, but I know nobody thought that this was weird that we have this exact same boilerplate in every single React app that's dealing with forms. And in Vue, you just have vmodel. Vmodel, exactly. You bind it to the state.
Two-way data binding.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's also one place that is like React developers hear, or some developers might hear and they don't like, because when they hear two-day data binding, I think that brings back memories of AngularJS and like the horrors of what can happen with two-way data binding. But I've always thought about in Vue.js, vmodel is still technically one-way data binding, but it's like syntactic sugar that makes it feel like two-way data binding.
Yeah, exactly. Like it is literally is syntactic sugar. Yeah. So it still props down events up. It's just like you don't have to write it manually all the time.
But and I think that's one other spot where potentially React developers or any other type of framework developer might see Vue and be like, it's too much magic, right? What is that vmodel doing? Can I trust it? But I think I've built enough applications where I want that magic. That like I know and I can trust what that thing is going to do. So I'm okay with choosing vmodel over add event listener and update state.
I think it's also like a certain degree of magic is really good. Also like Vue's reactivity system, for example, so you don't have to like explicitly define dependencies in like, I don't know, a use effect or a use memo whatsoever. So like it just works. You have computer properties, you have watchers, and they figure things out. Of course, with a watch, you have a watch effect where you can just write things as in computed, or you have an explicit watcher where you can watch multiple things, and that's great. But yeah, like a lot of people I've talked with that were not really into Vue were like, oh yeah, it's just too much magic. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how it's like how I can debug it. And luckily there are quite some good debug tools besides the Vue dev tools. You have like some on trigger and on track, I think, to see when a dependency is tracked and when, for example, computer is triggered and why, because of what changed. And of course, sometimes in like, I don't know, 5 or even 1% of the cases can be like, oh, this nested value doesn't update because I do some things around here. I had it as well a month ago where it's like, oh, that's really strange. Why it doesn't work? Yeah. Is it even a bug in the framework? But usually it's not. The problem is that okay, you put things off because of potential like 1%, if it's even 1% case, and put that away, but just saying like, okay, I don't know if I can trust it. I'd rather write my own code with my own maybe faulty logic that I probably won't write tests for. So yeah.
No, and I think that's the world that we're in. And I think you hit it spot on. Like they see the magic of like, oh, I don't want that. I'm just going to go write it myself. Now you have bugs. Now now you don't have test coverage. Like now you have all these other things you need to worry about. Now you have more code that you need to maintain. And the point about not having to specify dependencies, like that was huge for me. Like I've worked in some really large React code bases, and like I guess obviously at this point some people might just say skill issue. Like if you're like, well, your dependency array of a use effect is way too long. I think the issue is the API exposed by React like doesn't do us any favors. Like it doesn't give us any hints about how we could potentially do this better or do it more the React way. And so, yeah, I had worked in React code bases where a component would have like 5 different use effects, each of them with various dependency arrays. And some of the developers on the team, for whatever reason, weren't using ESLint. So they didn't get the linter warnings about missing dependencies. Like they would just run linter maybe on commit, or it was like on CI or something like that. But then they run across these bugs and like, why isn't this updating? Well, you forgot to pass it into the dependency array. But in Vue, automatic dependency tracking, it just works. It just works.
Yeah, and especially also, as you mentioned before, like deeply nested values also there. It just works. And if you need good performance in terms of, oh, I only change this when I set the value like fully fresh, I don't need deeply nested reactivity, you can also do that with like shallow ref, shallow reactive, and you're good. So like opting out of that behavior is also possible. But it's, to me, it's so fascinating that like React is a framework, and you mentioned it before with like the too much freedom, as in like, oh yeah, you can use one of these 5 different libraries for state management, and if you like just jump into another React application, the setup might be totally different, also with like styling, with everything, because yeah, it's basically the long time was okay, React is just a rendering library, the rest is like whatever you want to do. While on the other side of the spectrum, you have like Angular, be it like the new Angular. It's like, hey, we have everything a certain way and you have to do it this way. And I really think that Vue nails like the sweet spot in the middle, where you have a few things that are like, okay, reactivity, it's built in. This is the way how it goes. State management, we have Pina, peasy peasy, Vue router for routing. While, I don't know, does Vue need a built-in fetching library? No, you should use whatever you want. If you use Axios because, I don't know, you have some old legacy code that only works with that, go for it. Or if you use fetch natively or like a wrap around it whatsoever. While Angular, on the other hand, has like, oh, yeah, you have to use the HTTP client to do things. So the degree of freedom also, to me, it feels like right in the way where I think it's the most productive. It's still fast, it still works, and it gives me more joy than headache.
I agree with that. I think, and yeah, so it's basically like, where do you draw the line between what's built in versus what you can just reach for in a library? And I think React has drawn that line way too far on the wrong end, because then you just have too much freedom. And so, yeah, I completely agree with that. Definitely.
And when we even look from there a bit further, because like I know in the React ecosystem, it's very common to not just use plain React. In fact, it's even discouraged in the docs unless you open that little dialogue and like read through and say like, oh, you can also use Vite, for example. But nowadays you always use a meta framework, which is mainly Next.js, or for the brave people that are not going with the mainstream, Remix or React Router, as they migrated back, I heard. So it's really interesting, like that even the React team says, yeah, the preferred way is using a meta framework. While on the Vue side, I mean, you can use Vue with a script tag with just from a CDN in the end, which is, I think, the only major framework where that's still possible in a feasible way.
So I used to give a conference talk. It was like an overview of Vue.js. I gave it back in 2016 at a couple places. And that's always how I start is, look, you don't even need a build system. Literally just add a script tag and you can start to like gradually migrate. I think for a lot of people, especially maybe if you're not building full-fledged client-side applications, maybe you have like a little bit of jQuery here and there, adding Vue in for just a one-off page or one-off thing actually works really well. It's somewhat comparable to trying to use something like Alpine.js, where like it can just make that one little part interactive and it's less jQuery-esque. You can do the same thing with Vue, but then you get like the more declarative syntax and things like that.
I mean, you can even use Petite Vue. That was like Evan built as a response. We even had Evan on the show like quite some episodes ago where we talked about that Petite Vue is more or less feature complete. It's there, it works, it's really lovely. But of course, if you say like, okay, I have this big application, I want to migrate the front end from jQuery to like actual Vue components, then it's so nice, as you said, just drop in Vue, start step by step, and at some point you can add the build step. At some point when you figure things out, that's great. But to just get started to replacing jQuery, that's such a nice way to go. And the conversion will be very, very easy to just say like, okay, I add a build step at some point, then I use single file components and so on and so on.
Definitely. And so I had a thought to what we were talking about earlier about where frameworks should draw the line of what's built in versus what's not. I think that also could be part of why people don't choose Vue is on the surface, you can't see where that line is drawn. So on the surface, when you just come across Vue, you see all of this magic and you're like, well, what else is magic? What else have they done that I'm not going to be able to do myself? And that potentially scares off people that have more opinions or maybe don't want as much magic as well. So
that's a good point, actually. Yeah,
it could that like maybe there could be some sort of selling point that's like, here's all the magic, and maybe even a list of this is what's built in, this is what you're going to have to choose yourself, because that I think that could help reframe a React developer's view on it as well. Because I don't think we should spend time choosing a router, right? Like it does a thing. If it works, it works. Like let's use Vue router, right? Like we don't want 3 different choices or like 2 different meta frameworks for that. But yeah.
In React, that's still the case. I mean, and there are more things coming, right? Like Tanstack Start is in the making as well. So to me, it's also interesting that there are that many meta frameworks around it. I mean, with Next.js obviously being still the main choice and even more popular than, it depends on the survey, right? But it's very React-centric, sometimes more popular than Vue or Angular themselves, because it is so popular in the React ecosystem as well. So how do you think about like mainly using React with a meta framework versus like whether it would be better to just have a lot of things being able to use standalone? Like let's say React server components, for example. It's always a hot topic there where like, okay, Next.js has an implementation and other frameworks also have one at some point, right? Like Remix also were like planning to implement them and I think support them now. And Tanstack Start is also, but they had a really hard time. While, well, if it's a functionality from the core of React, why is it only usable with a meta framework, let's say?
Yeah, and I've done a little research there. So like I dove deep into the Next.js ecosystem because for the longest time, it was like, why do I need this meta framework? Like it's this like I can build React with Vite. It's completely fine. But yeah, so I started learning about Next and learning about the app router and everything else. And I did start diving into like what's required for React server components, but it does seem like at least the implementation itself is complicated enough that you would want to lean on a library or framework. And so like, even though it's built in, even though the React library itself provides the primitives for RSCs, you still would need to reach for something further. And so maybe something's going to come along that's like a lower level library. Maybe it's not a full meta framework, but maybe it's like maybe a plugin for Vinci or something like that. Some of these tools that allow you to build your own server-side rendered stack. And maybe there will be like an RSC plugin that just covers that piece, but then maybe you can do the rest.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's definitely something that could be helpful. Just like, I don't know, in nuxt.js, where I'm a team member of, so that's why I know a few things were in there. It's like we have a lot of things that are just also exposed as plugins. Like let's say auto imports or like auto imports. Okay, we have a plugin, you can just use them. That's fine in your normal Vue system. File system based routing has been in Nuxt for a long time, but now Eduardo, who is also maintaining the router, wrote an unplugin for that as well. So like, okay, you have file system based routing, you have type pages that all comes from the router now, which is of course way nicer because then everybody can benefit from that. And as you also mentioned, Vinci, which is based on Nitro, which is the server engine of Nuxt.js, and now of course also analog, solid start, Tanstack Start, and so on. Also, one more part is like, yeah, you're a little like DIY meta framework with like putting all these things together.
Well, it's interesting to see all of these parts being pulled out from the core, right? The fact that Nuxt has been structured in that way where it doesn't have to all be in the Nuxt repo or the Nuxt library. It's all of these things are more generic. They're not specific to Vue, so they get pulled out and then they can be reused by, maybe you don't want to use Vue. Maybe you just want to use the file-based routing with like API routers, so you can use like Nitro. Exactly. So yeah, it is interesting to see like that kind of like building block piece. I mean, I'm not super familiar with the Nitro ecosystem. Has anybody done like JSX server-side rendering with Nitro?
So that's pretty interesting because the latest version of the latest nightly Nitro version should even ship JSX support, so that you can straight away just render JSX there. And yeah, from there, it shouldn't be too much. Like, for example, I know Hono can do it out of the box, so Nitro will be able to do that too. And yeah, it's super interesting, as you said, that it's all that modular, which was in a way a main thought when like Nuxt 3 was rebuilt and rewritten. Even Nuxt 2, we had a few things like, okay, let's extract them because they're not really tied to the core. And then, of course, even if you think about like Unix philosophy, right? Like do one thing, isolate the scope, and so on and so on. It's very similar to say like, okay, we have lots of parts. If you put them together, it would be really nice. But they can also be used in their own projects. For example, Jitty is used in ESLint now. And it's a package probably just a few people even listening to this podcast know about, but it's used in Nuxt. It's used in a lot of spaces now, even, well, probably when you run ESLint. So
that's from the UnJS ecosystem?
Yes, correct.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I came across it because if you're building a Next app and you want to do TypeScript specific things in your Next config, you can use Jitty, which like just in time compiles the TypeScript.
Correct.
That's cool. Yeah, so like you're combining UnJS and the Next ecosystem. That's cool.
It's about time that happens. after Next is also the only framework that's not powered by Vue under the hood. Then at least a tiny bit from the Vue ecosystem swaps over there. But I think like also Nitro as more and more, I think the front end frameworks, but also the meta frameworks, they converge together. What we see, I don't know, every front end framework out there, every modern one uses signals now, right? From Angular over, of course, Vue with Ref, it's also just like implicit signals. Like it's implementation detail how they look like, but that's that. And also React at some point, right? So like with Solid, Preact, and so on and so on. We all move over there and agree, hey, that's a good thing. So at some point, I think it won't be, like it will be one thing less that's different between the frameworks. Like we all agree signals as the base, like primitive reactivity model, and then some syntactic sugar, some improvements on top of that. And with meta frameworks, it's pretty similar with like a lot of pieces saying, okay, let's use Nitro and then use Vinci, which is based on Nitro. And then, okay, that's the way to go there. And probably many other meta frameworks might follow. I know Angular was also looking into just researching if Nitro fits in the space. So that's also super interesting to see.
Definitely. I have a random thought, but Vue did signals first, and I'm mad about it because like when signals started like getting super hyped on like X and YouTube and everything, I was like, Vue has been doing this for so long, and I think that's one of the issues Vue potentially has. It's almost just like a marketing issue. It's like
it's true.
It's like, I don't know, it's not talked about in the same way. It's maybe not hyped in the same way, but. It was so funny to see Solid come along with signals. Like they didn't invent signals, but they were one of the first to popularize it. And it's like, Vue has been doing this all along. It's just signals.
Yeah, exactly.
Like fine-grained reactivity. Yeah.
it's just not written as the typical signal way is doing now. And I mean, of course, like Knockout had him before. Obviously, yes, that's correct. But also the term signal is even like if you ask a Vue developer who's not necessarily into other frameworks, like, okay, do you use signals? Like, what's that? Like, oh yeah, if you use like, do you use Ref? And like, yeah, sure, no problem. So I agree. It's the marketing part is especially interesting because I think there is a downside that there is not that much drama in the Vue community, let's say.
Yeah.
Because like, oh yeah, and React, we have that a lot. Like, okay, people on Twitter fighting whatsoever. Angular, we had like, oh yeah, RxJS, signals, this, that. There, and also like, oh yeah, a big marketing with the Angular Renaissance, and now merging with Wiz and so on. We have like Svelte, of course, 12.5, big release, and Runes and this and that. But Vue is still continuously shipping nice features, like in the core, lazy hydration and so on and so on. But it's not that, it's not that polarizing. It's not that popular. And I was talking with Evan a couple days ago in Japan, actually, about Void Zero. So a totally different topic that will come out. I think might be even out when that episode airs, that will be linked. And it's also like, it's fine for like a 10-year-old framework to not have like groundbreaking changes. And there might not be that much hype around it. But then, of course, the downside might also be that it's not that much talked about.
Yeah, and then you have the issue of, well, if it's not talked about, then potentially it's not going to be brought up in a conversation of, well, we have a decision to make. We haven't decided on React yet. What are our other choices? What have other people seen? And if it's not in the public sphere, if it's not being talked about, then it's not going to come up in that conversation. Because I think ultimately what it comes down to is like that's when those decisions have to be made to make Vue more of a mainstream decision. Is companies have to be based on them, and there have to be tons of developers that are hired there, or hired for their Vue skills, to basically kick off that trend of like more and more people using Vue and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but as you said before, I think the job market for Vue doesn't look that bad compared to other like less, let's say, less old or less matured frameworks. Like even like I don't know, if you look at Svelte, Solid, Quick, and so on, there is like there is a big gap between the Vue job market and then all these, of course. Angular is probably depends on the region, somewhat on par. I know, for example, Germany is a big Angular space in general, like the German-speaking regions. Because they also like Java a lot, but okay, that's not, of course, the only cause for that. But yeah, still, like, of course, between React and everything else is a big gap. But for like also choosing like bigger projects, choosing Vue, like Wikimedia chose Vue as their framework of choice for all the things they'll build if they need JavaScript for it. And like all these things are helpful in the conversations. Like, okay, if there are big companies betting on that, then there must be a reason for that. And even if you look once again at the meta framework side, it's really interesting. I was talking about it also like a couple of weeks ago of like Vue and innovation. Well, of course, once again, Vue is like it's matured quite a lot. And while React now went the way of like, okay, we build server components in React itself. Like we changed the paradigm of like, okay, everything front end to like, well, more or less server, not first, but well, server included. That won't happen with Vue. And on the other hand, all these experiments can be made in a meta framework, right? So that's why, on the other hand, all the news about nuxt.js, with like all the features shipped in every minor, they are pretty cool. And I see a lot of traction, be it like the Nuxt dev tools, where even like React people are like, hey, why can't we have these nice things?
I mean, I tried Nuxt, I guess it was a few weeks ago. Those dev tools are insane. Like,
right. And you can even customize them. You can like add things on there. Like there are some modules. For example, there's a module for OG image generation. And you have like all the preview and testing, everything in the dev tools built in. So it's really, really amazing. And there's so many more things, of course, that like Nuxt just allows you to do. And sometimes like, I think, at Nuxt, we do a little bit better with the marketing, as in like there are just more features. So it's of course easier to show like, hey, we can do this and that. Of course, there are also some more opinionated things. But then on the other hand, when I watch a lot of like program YouTubers, when I have the time for that here and there, I feel like, of course, everything is very like React centric and like other frameworks, but especially Vue are often like left out in a way. Like we still hear about Angular or Svelte in there, but like Vue or especially Nuxt, sometimes I feel like they're not part of the conversation, as you said. And it's a bit sad because there are a lot of things happening there. So I would like to see that definitely more.
Yeah. And it's one thing I'm trying to bring to the syntax team. And they appreciated that too. I think one of the first or second podcast episodes they had me on, I was like, we talked about Vue.js and it's like, you should try Vue. And it's tricky because in the content creation space, like, ultimately, you're trying to get views, and the majority of people are using React. They're using Next. So if you want to do things that get eyes on them, you're going to use the more popular stuff or make videos about the more popular stuff. So it's tricky. But I have tried creating Vue content on the syntax channel, and I think people appreciate it as well because it's hard though, because I did on the syntax channel, I did a 4-part video series on Vue versus React. It was I built a bunch of different apps. I was comparing and contrasting. Those videos did not do well.
Yeah, I remember we briefly even talked about it, even tweeted like, hey, that but it's in a way it's sad because like it's super interesting, but maybe as you said, like the big, let's say, listener base, they probably focused on React and Next.js, and then they're like, hey, why should I compare that to the framework? I'm set in already. Why should I?
And it also comes down to like, are they decision makers, right? Because if they're at a job and they have to use React, it's potentially not worth their time, or they might not think it's worth their time to learn about this other stuff. They're like, well, I'm getting paid for React. Why would I even learn about Vue or whatever else? And I think that was also one of the issues with the videos that I made is I don't know if I positioned it well enough or sold it well enough to like why React developers should even care. But it's kind of the examples I showed are just like night and day in terms of like state updates and then also like dependency tracking with use effects. And I kind of just tried to show all the things that we've already talked about that I have issues with React. Like, why do we have to do it this way? And showed side-by-side comparisons with Vue. But I think, again, if you're hired to use React, you don't want to hear about how bad React is or how something else is better because you're not getting paid to write that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one part, especially for developers. And okay, I do this work. Maybe even in my free time, I'm happy to stay away from the computer, which is more than fine. then it's like, yeah, okay, I do that because that's what my company's working at. I don't have to care about the rest. I agree. That's definitely a thing. I think also on the other hand, it's like I was planning on doing a talk probably for some conferences next year, just like highlighting more or less what has Vue ever done for you, as in like all the things that we just mentioned, like Nitro, for example, UnJS, Volar, the Vue language tools, so to say, now as a framework to also support like, I don't know, MDX and Astro, maybe Svelte in the future and so on. And of course, Vite, what everybody more or less uses now, just to highlight, hey, okay, these come from the ecosystem. Even if you are not familiar with the framework and you might just like give it a shot, like it's not for you, you still use a lot of things of this ecosystem. And without Vue being there, we wouldn't have these things in the way they're there. I mean, Vite was there because Evan wanted to improve the developer experience, so to say, for Vue.js. This is how that started to happen. It's quite fascinating what eventually emerged from there.
It's super cool to see because, a lot of people don't even realize that. I mean, anybody writing front-end code, you're probably your code is touching some code that Evan wrote potentially, like with Vite, or even stuff from like the UnJS ecosystem or Nitro. Yeah, it's interesting to see, and it kind of like it begs the question: well, if all this cool stuff is coming out of this ecosystem, then maybe Vue is cool too, maybe Nuxt is cool too. But it's interesting.
Definitely. It's also one more thing that, like, let's say that the ecosystem in React is of course pretty big because there are a lot of people writing React. Not even focusing on the job market, but like libraries, of course, being at like component libraries, Chatsy, and of course Radix, and so on. But also, like, I don't know, Framer Motion, and basically everything you have out there. While it's of course more difficult for other ecosystems to, let's say, catch up on that, even though catch up is not the right version or like wording. But it's probably also more, if I remember Headless UI from the Tailwind team, Adam himself being like a huge Vue fan and now writing mainly React. And switched over, and the team focusing on, okay, we have Headless UI version 2 for React, and Vue exists, but it's still version 1. And seeing similar cases for, I don't know, first-class SDKs for tools, saying, okay, we have React support and everything else is optional. That's, I think, also one more reason why people say, like, okay, if I have a straightforward integration there, I start a new project, then less code, right? So yeah, that's another issue, I guess.
It's true. And I've heard that issue echoed as well. Like when I was creating that series on the syntax channel, I had some tweets where there was some conversation about like, so I tweeted like, what's stopping you from switching to Vue? I know it was kind of like bait because like people were like, well, why would I switch to Vue? But there's a lot of really good conversation in there. And one of them is, well, I need a library for this. I need a library for that. And a lot of times Vue might have something, but maybe it's not as well supported. Maybe it hasn't been around as long. So that's a harder part as well, because at the end of the day, a lot of the apps that we're building are kind of just, they're Lego apps. We're plugging all of these things together to build the greater thing. And React has a whole lot more Legos available than Vue.js does.
That's true. But on the other hand, like, of course you have the popular libraries, but then you have, I think with small libraries, the same issue of like, okay, this has like 20 stars on GitHub and I can just randomly use it. You can probably do it in every ecosystem. But yeah, that I think also in a way that like a lot of libraries coming from the React ecosystem are ported over, like especially component libraries. So like, okay, we can easily support it as well. And then I sometimes wonder which things are unique to an ecosystem that come from there. And I think once again, the Vue ecosystem, we have a lot of things that are pretty cool and originated from there, even besides like Vite, UnJS, Volar. One example always comes to mind is FormKit as like just form library for Vue, which is pretty amazing, like using it. It has a phenomenal developer experience. It works so well because the people behind FormKit really thought well about how to structure things also from an architectural point of view. So, and that's a library that doesn't exist in React right now. Of course, the other form libraries in React, but I think that's, at least from what I've tried so far, the best one in terms of understanding and modeling.
Yeah, I haven't used it or seen it, so I'll have to look into it.
Worth trying out, yeah.
Definitely.
One other thing that really changed Vue, I think, was the Vue 2 to Vue 3 upgrade, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think the biggest thing, and probably was like the biggest, let's say, quote unquote drama, and it's still, well, in some minds out there still ongoing, is the topic of the new composition API. Like, I mean, it's out there for almost 5 years now, but like quote unquote new versus options API. As someone who also started with the options API, like you did, the composition API was a big change. And nowadays I almost only write composition API code unless there's some legacy things around. But how did you experience the change? How do you experience just the composition API itself? And what's your favorite?
Yeah, so I followed it from the early days. Like I remember releasing a video on Coding Garden where I used like a pre-release version of the composition. Well, I used the composition API when it was a separate library that you could pull in. Mm-hmm. And I showed like how it works. And I was like, this is potentially coming to Vue. But I've been a fan from the beginning, mainly because it's less boilerplate, right? Like you're not exporting an object with all of these sections. You can just pull in the things you need. And to me, that is in line with how most Vue code has been, which is like as little as possible to get the work done, and it's simple. But I think one of the issues is, and I've talked to a lot of people about it since, and I did a talk on the Vue composition API at DenverScript, and some of the feedback was like, isn't this just going to create like really messy code bases? Basically, it takes a certain amount of discipline to write it in a composable, or write it in a way that can be maintained as well. And it's super interesting to see. Like there are some people were telling me, like at their company, they introduced the composition API, and the developers would write comments, data, yes, methods, computed. And so they're basically like recreating the options API with all of these composition functions. Correct. And so yeah, I think it's also it's a learning thing as well, because I've realized in my career, like architecting code in a scalable and maintainable way is a hard thing to do. And so if the framework isn't showing you how to do that, then a lot of developers aren't going to do that because they're going to do the minimum to get it done. So ultimately, I like it, especially when they introduced script setup. I think when they released it, it came out with script setup, but
it actually didn't. It was like in 3.1 or 3.2. Yes, sadly.
Okay. But I just remember I remember seeing the RFC and I was like, this is it. Like basically, it's svelte now. Like we no boilerplate at all. Just like write your code. And so that was really cool to see. But yeah, I understand people's reasons for not using it or not liking it, because like it can be hard. It definitely takes some practice and some work to know how to structure those composition APIs in a way that will be maintainable. But at the end of the day, I think it was a good change also potentially for React developers that are moving over to Vue, because it's not the same, but it has a similar feel in that you have these little functions like useEffect or useState or all the things you're familiar with in React, but now you can use them inside of Vue.
Yeah, it's definitely closer to React hooks. That's true. I mean, there's even a chapter aligning, like explaining the similarities, let's say, and inspiration. But it's really funny to mention the comments basically replicating the options API structure, because I made a video like, I don't know, not half a year, even a bit longer, about exactly that. It's one of my most popular ones, of like organizing code with the composition API, because I really think if you use composition API and do that, then that like you, as you said, you replicated structure, why you should just group things by logical concern, say the code that belongs together logically and not by type, by like, oh, all the computeds, all the state, that should go together. And another thing I see people not doing very often is what you do in a normal JavaScript or TypeScript file. You create functions, right? And people, when they use reactivity and like refs and computeds, they put them next to each other, but they don't put them in extra function, because then like, okay, what should I do with that? So or they do that, they write a new file like in a composables folder and say use whatsoever.js, and then they put it in there. But if it just lives in one component, just write a function at the very end of it, like you really like newspaper code style, and call it, I don't know, use, I don't know, message or whatsoever. Do your thing there, call it on the top, and you have a wonderful architecture and structure. If you can't fully split the component up even, right? That's also an option. But if you have a component that's like orchestrating a lot of things, then like these concern-based inline composables, they help a lot. And funnily, that was always how the composition API was imagined to be. Maybe you remember that screenshot with like that color, the color blocks in the RFC of the composition API with like options API or composition API. And lots of people are like, oh yeah, can we get that at some time like unblurred? Technically it's not even important, but if you take the new file of the composition API that Evan rewrote for that RFC, it was like part of the Vue CLI. He even does that. He even used these like inline composables that says, okay, like the first 10 lines after imports are like calling these functions in the bottom. So I think also there, it's just people were so used to options API, and then like, oh, composables, we can share code now. Let's extract everything. it was a lot of overcorrecting. But also by now, I think that's way more clear. And as you said before, you need some guidance, you need some structure, some architectural patterns as well to actually make the composition API work well, as in like not writing spaghetti code. And there one could also say like, yeah, skill issues, like we had before, which is in a way it's kind of fair. But like even just with a handful of rules, it works pretty well. The problem is, and we had Natalia in the episode from the Vue core team writing a lot of documentation, working in GitLab, who's still using the options API there. If you have a lot of developers with like different skill set, different experience, you really need to have that structure. If you have like just, I don't know, a couple people on the team, it's easier, right? As long as you have code reviews and things. But if you're a big organization, it's not an easy switch at all. So, and then like finding good rules and also that all developers agree with them, that's another challenge. So I also understand the concerns of people saying, okay, options API is easier for me. I know where I find my things. It's easier to review. It's easier to write for everyone. But I still think it's worth to put in that effort to make the composition API work. Also because it's the future and also because there are a lot of shortcomings in the options API that were resolved, right? Especially TypeScript. But of course, also sharing logic, less magic, even less this dot whatsoever. So it's nice that it's there.
Yeah, I think that was the other big thing. Like last thing you mentioned is this dot. So seeing this dot all over the place in the component built with the options API, it felt like, I don't know, it felt like OOP. It was like, well, what is this? Do I have to worry about it? And so, it's really simplified things to be able to, you have these nice little functions. Everything is available within that scope. You don't have to worry about this. But I completely agree. I think it's ultimately, I think if and maybe you've created this like a place of a lot of examples of how things can be structured, that will help a lot of people. Because I know a lot of programmers that get onboarded to a new code base, they potentially try to follow the patterns that they see in the code base already. And so if they can see, oh, this is a good example of how I can use the composition API effectively, and I don't have to pull out everything. Because it can go in both directions. You can like refactor too hard and now like all your stuff is in other files and it's hard to find, or you don't refactor at all and now it's all just in one component. And so because it's up to the developer, yeah.
And I've seen both in like code bases that do consultancy mainly, besides content creation and the podcast and so on. It's like I've seen people, with like 1,000 lines of scripts set up, and I've seen people with like, okay, I have 100 composables each in their own file, and they're only just used in one component. So it actually can go both ways.
Yeah. So hopefully like there's more examples out there and people can like learn better ways of doing it. I don't know if the docs potentially has anything like that, but that's the one piece that I think is hard for a lot of people. And like I've met people as well that use Vue that were like, I'm not even going to use the composition API because it's just too messy. Like I need not structure. Too messy. Like the structure. I need structure. And so they stick with the options API.
Yeah, I mean, I think there should be some kind of cookbook or something. That would be like, I think, really good. I said with some examples. I mean, there's some videos on the topic, and I think the docs also covered it. I remember they even had an example of like how to migrate over and refactoring. But I guess the more the merrier, right? And also one other thing, it's more or less a running joke on the podcast by now because we said in so many episodes, VueUse as a library, so many good composables out there, and they're all open source. They have some rules on how they write composables, so that's like a really good way of just reading through the source code of some of them, and also just a guide of like contribution guide, how to write a good composable, and then apply that to your own. Because like what the rules that they have, they work pretty well. Like, okay, composables should be able to either take like a reactive input, like a ref, for example, or also normal inputs, and then of course convert them to do whatever they need to do with them, and so on, so on. So they're really, really good ones, and worth checking out. So if you haven't done that out there, definitely worth doing.
Nice.
And the other thing you mentioned, the script setup part versus the composition API without script setup. Evan mentioned that as like the biggest mistake with the Vue 2 to Vue 3, like the composition API release, that they didn't start with that straight away. Mainly also because a lot of developers heard like, oh yeah, new API is out. Also from other frameworks looking into Vue, they checked it and it was basically composition API without script setup. So it was lengthy. It was not as elegant as it is now with script setup. It was confusing here and there. Like, oh, why do I have to return all these things? And now how can I mix the two things in the options API and the setup function? Now it's pretty clear and elegant, as you mentioned before. But yeah, in that time, and even though it was, I don't know, maybe 2 months or something, maybe less, I can't pinpoint that. it probably hurt Vue as a framework with the new API a lot, because just people remember that of like, that doesn't look nice. Oh no, that's not what we're going to do.
Yeah. That's super tricky. Like and again, like just to miss it by 2 months, like just to have a slightly better idea, but everybody remembers the old one. Yeah, that's super tricky.
But I think that's also like nowadays it's always the case. If you like start, I don't know, ranting about something or taking a look at something, you always remember like the first impression, which even if like, I don't know, you read the one example I just remember is the announcement blog post of Void Zero, like Evan's new company, is like, okay, there's some things explained in the start, and you might wonder, okay, that sounds weird. And if you read further, you'll find some more in-depth information. While, of course, if you read the first sentences and then some reaction, you're just like, oh, hey, weird. That's not good, and ramble about it and like rant already. And then people, of course, write comment and just remember that. While, okay, 15 minutes later, there you go. Here's the explanation.
Yeah.
Tricky. Very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's just being human. We want we don't want to do the work, essentially. Like, we remember the old thing. We're not going to update our knowledge, or we want to read just as minimal as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sticks also with us, right? It's like, okay, first impression, oh, sucks. Not even listening further. It's like, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it was really nice to have a little like look into Vue versus other frameworks out there. We could even talk about some more. We briefly touched on Nitro and some meta frameworks, so maybe that could be something for another episode. It'd be lovely to have you back on here for sure, CJ.
Yeah, this is super fun. I love just chatting and geeking out. So yeah, I'd love to be back on at some point.
100%. Very nice. Then the last question, where can people follow you, CJ?
Sure. Yeah, so youtube.com/@syntaxfm. You can find all of the content that I've been creating for Syntax. And youtube.com/@codinggarden. That has all of my live streams and videos that I've done there. And if you go to coding.garden, that's the full domain, it has links to all my Twitch channel and all my other stuff as well.
I'll also put it in the show in the description, of course, and the domain is always so lovely. Such a clean name. CJ, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure, and hopefully you'll be on again in a future episode, as just mentioned. For everybody, thanks for joining, thanks for listening. Check out some older episodes. If this was the latest and newest that you're checking out, also some of the episodes that were mentioned throughout this episodes are linked as well. And if that's not the newest episode, then go continue. Listen to the next one, and see you soon. Thanks, everybody.